Good afternoon. My name is Carol Levy, and I'm a JDC board member and a member of the JDC Archives Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you today to today's webinar. We are thrilled that so many of you have joined us from around the world, including 18 countries, including China, India, Norway, Israel, and of course the US. The JDC Archives holds the records of JDC since its creation 106 years ago. As such, it is one of the most important resources for the study of modern Jewish history, hosting scholars from around the world, as well as publishers, curators, filmmakers, researchers of families and institutions, and others who use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in the JDC archives. Today, we have the good fortune of having Professor Fred Lazin as our speaker. Professor Lazin is a professor emeritus at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. He earned a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago and joined the faculty at Ben Gurion University in 1975. He retired in 2010. In 2018, he was a visiting fellow at Fudan University in Shanghai. He has taught at Hebrew University, UCLA, George Washington University, Cornell, Tufts, and CUNY. He recently became a member of the International Advisory Board of the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum. He has authored over 80 scholarly articles and chapters in books and written and edited 12 books. His latest book, American Christians and the National Interreligious Task Force for Soviet Jewry, A Call to Conscience, was published by Lexington Books in 2019. I would be remiss in not commenting that in addition to being a scholar, a researcher, a writer, and a teacher, he is also a grandfather. He's the proud grandfather of Carmen Bell Lazin, Ariel Regev, and Eden Isabel Lazin. The title of the lecture today is JDC and the European Refugees in Postwar Shanghai. Our format is that the speaker will speak for 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions anytime during the lecture or when the lecture concludes. Professor Lazin will now begin his lecture.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in a program under the auspices of the JDC Archives. I would first like to thank Linda Levy, who directs the archives, for making the research possible. It's a great place to do research. One gets a lot of support. I would also mention that yesterday I lost my mentor and close friend, Mr. Mel Reesfield of Jerusalem, Israel. He was the one that began me on my road to scholarship, to Jewish identity, and so many other things many, many years ago in Camp Tel Yehuda. May his memory be blessed. Today I'm going to be talking about, can we put up the PowerPoint? Yeah, thank you. I'm going to be talking about JDC and the European refugees in post-war Shanghai. Okay, next slide, please. What I'm focusing on, and this should be clear to everyone, is JDC's aid to the European refugees from August 1945, when the war ended, through March 1948. During this period of time, there were two local JDC representatives, meaning they were the directors that JDC sent over from New York or from the United States to run the program in Shanghai. The first was Manuel Siegel, who served from the end of the war in 45 through January of 1946. He was followed by Charles Jordan, who began in January of 46 through March of 1948. What I'm going to do is to examine and comment on JDC policies. In particular, policies that dealt with the issue, are the immigrants going to remain here in China, be integrated into Shanghai and the Chinese economy, or are they going to leave? If they are going to leave, where will they go to? The United States, be repatriated to Germany and Austria, where most of them came from, or will some go to the new Jewish state, which is about to be established in Palestine? Second general issue that I'll be dealing with, or policy, had to do with international agencies. There was a whole series of international groups, a whole group of several international organizations. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which provided aid of several sorts to the refugees. There was the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, established all the way back in 1938 following the Evian Conference. There was also the China National Relief and Rehabilitation Authority, and then the International Refugee Organization, which was set up in 1947. All of these groups provided food, medicine, housing, and also financed much of the immigration of refugees. And finally, I would like to emphasize that my presentation today is presenting Shanghai through the eyes of the JDC, not through the refugees. We have hundreds of excellent accounts. People give testimony, people write books, people that lived in Shanghai, the refugees themselves, that went through the experiences. These are valuable resources to anyone that wants to understand what happened. I would suggest equally as important is to look at JDC, that was funding much of the relief, in charge of much of the emigration and the movement out. What did JDC think? What were their views? What were their policies? How did they see this situation? That's my intent today. Next slide, please. Now, here we see, I'll just mention here, on the right-hand side is Manny Siegel, the first director. He was put in prison, I'll explain in a moment, by the Japanese, and then he took over when he left the prison camp. And on the left here, you see Charles Jordan. On the left-hand side, he was the director. He incidentally was killed in Prague in 1968, working for JDC at the time, possibly killed by the Soviets. It's never really been revealed what happened. He happens to be in a rickshaw in Shanghai with Harry Herbert. Harry Herbert was from the Jewish Welfare Bureau. They sent him over to the Far East to deal with Jewish refugees as well. They cooperated often, and Jordan later sent Herbert to Hong Kong to try to get the refugees to go via Hong Kong to Australia. Next slide. Now, a little background very quickly, the significance of Shanghai. If we look at the period of the Holocaust and the events of the killing of the 6 million, it's clear that until June of 1941, most Jews in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia could leave the Third Reich. This is based on the research by Timothy Snyder of Yale and others. And if you look at the example of Eichmann when he first came to Prague, what was his job? Not to deport Jews to camps, but to get them out of the Third Reich. The major problem was most people had no place to go. In the case of the United States, there were the quotas that kept people out. There was also the discriminatory policies of the consuls that didn't want to let Jews into the United States. And of course, you can take the example of the Evian Conference in July of 1938, called by President Roosevelt. All the major nations of the world come together. We have to deal with Jewish refugees. No one wants to take them. Shanghai, in contrast to almost every other place in the world, was what we called an open port, reflecting the colonial factor. There was no Chinese sovereignty over the city. There was something called extraterritoriality. This meant that the foreign powers, who may be in particular Great Britain, France, the United States, Japan, Germany, other countries. They were in the city of Shanghai. They controlled various parts of the city, but their citizens that lived in Shanghai, let's say British citizens, they didn't come under Chinese law. They came under British law. They committed a crime. It would have to be a violation of British law. They'd be tried in a British court in Shanghai. So you had a situation of no Chinese sovereignty over much of the city. There was something called an international settlement controlled by the British, Americans, and to some extent the Japanese. The French concession controlled by the French Consulate, and then the Japanese were in the city. Now, they were spread in various places, but in 1937, there was fighting between Japanese forces, and they drove out the Chinese forces. Basically, from 1937, 1938 on, the Japanese controlled the city, but they stood back, let the British, the Americans, the French handle their small territory there. And they eventually took over following Pearl Harbor. But this situation resulted in a situation which anyone could come in, anyone in the world could show up and come into Shanghai. They didn't need a visa, they didn't need a passport. And that's how close to 20,000 Jews from Hitler's Third Reich found refuge in Shanghai. Next slide. The European refugees after 1933. Most came in 1938. In 1938, you had Anschluss, Hitler going into Austria, Hitler going into Czechoslovakia, and then, of course, November 9th and 10th, 1938, the Kristallnacht pogrom. Now, as a result, Jews started coming to Shanghai in large numbers. Just one point, which might be surprising to people, there were hundreds of Jewish men in concentration camps within Germany. If they could prove they had a passage, a ticket to go to Shanghai, they were let out of the camps. There were even rumors, I can't give you documentation on this, where the Gestapo was about to charter a boat. They probably did charter a boat to take refugees from Germany to Shanghai. So they come in through after 1938. By the end of 1939, there were already local restrictions limiting the number of people coming. More important than that, in June of 1940, when Italy entered the war against the Allied powers, the sea route to Shanghai stopped. Planes weren't flying that time from Europe to Shanghai, so it was very hard to get there. The other way of coming was by the Trans-Siberian route across the Soviet Union. That continued until June of 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. About 1,000 or more Polish Jews ended up in Japan or stayed in Japan, and then right before Pearl Harbor, they were transferred over to Shanghai. The number in Shanghai after, the number in Shanghai, about 18,000 probably came. That's a figure Bauer uses. There were probably about 15,000 at the end of the war. Let me just correct that. The estimate is anywhere between 16 to 18,000 were in Shanghai during the war. At the end of the war, we seem to find about 15, 16,000 European refugees in the city of Shanghai. Next slide, please. Here you see a picture from Kobe, Japan. This is the Mira Yeshiva group. They fled across Siberia. They got visas from Sugihara in Kovno, the Japanese consul, and the Japanese transferred them all over to Shanghai in 1941, and they operated the yeshiva during the war, but that's not today's story. Next slide. Now, there were two local Jewish communities very quickly, the living Jewish communities in Shanghai from the 1840s on. There were the Baghdadi or the Sfaradi, under 1,000. the most famous families being Sassoon, Kadoorie, and Hardoon. There were a lot of poor Baghdadi Jews, many middle class. They often worked for these three families in different ways. The larger community were the Russians or Ashkenazim, who came after the Russian Revolution in various waves, 6,000 to 8,000. The Baghdadis set up the Committee for the Assistance of European Jewish Refugees, known as the Spielman Committee. They provided aid for the refugees. They ran out of money. They turned to JDC in 1938. And from then on, JDC supported them. JDC sent over a woman by the name of Laura Margolis in the spring of 41. She was later joined by Manny Siegel in November of 41. They were going to help refugees, Jewish refugees, move from China to the United States. They were also there to try to redo or deal with, help with the problems of the Spielman Committee to make it much, much more effective, efficient, and even humane. Laura was repatriated. Now, what they did was, once the war started, all funding was cut off from the United States. They arranged for local loans with the cooperation of the Japanese, and they set up local committees. They realized they were going to be interned or sent out of the country. So who would run the aid? So they set up a local committee, helped set up the kitchen committee, various JDC committee, etc. Laura was repatriated. Manny was interned in a camp. Next slide, please. Here you see on the left, there's Victor Sassoon on the left and Michael Spielman of the committee. Here's Laura Margolis, who went to work for JDC after the war, or as soon as she actually came back to the States. Next slide. Now, in 1944, JDC began funding again. They had permission from the Department of Treasury, and they basically provided about $100,000 a month into these committees which existed. The money came by way of Switzerland. JDC in 1945 aided about 11,000 refugees. What's interesting is, and often this is overlooked, 85% of the refugees were Jewish, 15% were non-Jews, Catholic and Protestant. What's interesting about the city after the war, the Chinese national government, Chiang Kai-shek, controlled the city. The Allies had ended extraterritoriality in 43, and the US Army was present. The job of the US Army was to get the Japanese troops out of the country. Siegel either escaped from a prison camp or he walked out when it was liberated, comes back to Shanghai and takes over to try to run the operation. JDC, it took them a month or two to rehire him as director, but they paid his salary all throughout the war to his family in the States. He worked with the existing committees, the aid committees, which he had set up or helped to set up. He considered them corrupt, incompetent, and inefficient. He dismissed the Baghdadis and the Russians. What does that mean? He said, look, at the Baghdadi community and the Russian community, they already turned rather than take care of their own poor, they gave us, JDC, you take care of our poor. So we really can't turn to them to help us out in the situation. He also had a very negative view of the refugees. He wanted very little to do with them. Not very little to do with them. He just thought that they were broken. They can't do anything. They can't help themselves. Had this very, very negative attitude. He also wrote and said, look, there are too many refugees, 50, 10,000, 12,000, et cetera. They'll never be able to integrate into China. Now, one thing that he did do, he established relations with the American forces. There was a Rabbi Fine who became the liaison between the American Army and, the American Army and the refugees. And a lot of Jewish GIs wanted to help. They set up tours between American soldiers to come to visit the Jewish area of Shanghai, et cetera. and about 1,500 went to work for the Americans. This was like a blessing from heaven. I don't know how to put it, but the salaries were through the roof. The director of JDC, if you work for the American Army, you probably made more than the director or anyone working for the JDC organization. These were great jobs, and about 1,500 were hired. Now, I mentioned here the name Kay Cheng. That's Kimberly Cheng, a doctoral student at NYU who's doing research on the refugees in Shanghai, but also from the perspective of the local Chinese population. What one should keep in mind is that the local Chinese, many of them saw the Americans as occupying the country, also as being foreigners. For the Jewish refugees, our brothers have come, they're liberating us, they're Jewish soldiers, it's America. They were in love with America, they wanted America, most of them wanted to go to America. The Chinese were a little more ambivalent. And one of the things that happened when Chinese worked for the American Army, they made a third, a quarter, a half of what the European refugees made. In other words, there was discrimination. And the Chinese were aware of this, and they resented the fact that the European refugees got the better jobs. Okay, next slide. Now, Siegel is in charge. The first thing he did was he thought the United Nations Relief and Refugee Administration, let them take over caring for the refugees. That's what they're supposed to do. Point the fact, the UNRRA aided 800,000 Chinese refugees. So what's another 10,000? So he drew up proposals and negotiated where they would spend about $260,000 a month for aid to keep the refugees alive and housed and clothed. And then JDC would spend $1,000 to rehabilitate them, to train them, to give them skills either to work in China or wherever they might resettle afterwards. That deal never worked out. Now, with someone named Robert Lang, Dr. Robert Lang, he worked for JDC, he was a refugee. Siegel switched to cash assistance. Before the war, one of the big things the JDC did was they fed everyone. So they decided we're better off to just give cash assistance and let people feed themselves. Food was very, very cheap. Plus, they got a lot of food aid from the UNRRA. So what they did was they closed all the kitchens. They cut the staff from 587 down to 300. They kept the committees. They also added a residential committee, letting people have a say in what was happening. Now, the numbers on JDC relief. The very poor amongst the refugees got relief. So if you look at the numbers for July of 47, when they ended partial relief. So beginning in October of 45, close to 11,000 were on relief. May of 46, it's down to 7,700. By the time you get to the end of what we're dealing with today, in February of 48, it's down to 3,500. Now, what accounts for this is the outward migration, emigration. That's why the numbers keep dropping. Now, in addition to cash assistance from JDC, UNRRA also gave relief in the form of food. So at the end of the war, it was about 9,000. In July of 47, they were giving almost 8,000 people food aid. Next slide. Now, here you see a US soldier taking pictures with other soldiers, Jewish children. They set up all these tours. A lot of GIs wanted to donate, to help out, to volunteer, etc. Next. Now, one of the issues that came up was some religious issues that Leavitt is head of JDC in New York. That's the headquarters. In November of 45, he had to clarify some religious issues. What came up was some ultra-Orthodox groups were complaining, we're aiding non-Jews. Why should Jewish money go to non-Jews? There were a lot of non-Jews getting aid, et cetera. That bothered some people. And they were also bothered by non-Jews working for JDC. Some people wanted to make everything, observe the Sabbath, everything should be kosher, etc. So Leavitt made it clear that in a crisis like Shanghai, JDC helps all Jews and Christians. We don't make a distinction. What he said was later on, we'll then turn to Christian refugee groups that maybe they want to help us dealing with the Christian refugees, but we never turn away Christian refugees. The Christian refugees, these 15%, they lived amongst the Jews. They lived in what we call the homes. They lived in the same housing. Their kids went to the same schools with the Jewish refugees. Now, on Kashrut, they decided, JDC, we're willing to spend more money to make sure that our facilities, like the hospital, has kosher food. That was a big issue, big expense. However, what happened was when they set up an old age home, there was the issue of to be or not to be, non-kosher food. They used UNRRA provisions, or else they would have gone bankrupt. Keeping Shabbat, a great idea, said New York JDC, but we're not going to force anything on people. If they don't want to observe the Shabbat, they don't have to. People should be free to do that. Now, in terms of employing non-Jews, the issue was this, one of the top people, Dr. Robert Lang. He was a baptized Jew. So Leavitt said, we have more trouble. He made the point, it's interesting to see from the perspective of looking back in 1945, he said, our organization should not have in its leadership roles non-Jews, especially baptized Jews. That was a bigger problem. But he said to the local JDC director, look, if you can't find someone to replace Lang, then let him stay. Now, later on, Jordan is going to praise the treatment of Christians, how they live amongst us, they get our aid, etc. But that's something which takes place later on. Okay, let's move on. Next slide. Siegel is very tired. When Siegel was in the camp, he wasn't tortured. Very few people were tortured in these internment camps, but he came down with many, many diseases, dysentery and other things. So he wanted to he was always tired, and everyone that had contact with him and wrote back to New York said he's tired. So he made the point in a letter on October 22nd, I'm tired. He complained about the fact that there was no government policy about the status of the refugees. China now had sovereignty. China's a new nation. It's an independent nation. What's the status of refugees? There was no official government policy. A lot of the press in English and in Chinese, of course, was saying, we want the refugees out. We want the refugees out. Now, so Siegel asked to be replaced. They announced that Jordan would replace him. They also mentioned two other names from New York. One was Mo Beckelman, who had worked for JDC in Lithuania before the war. He was coming to work with the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. He was going to do a survey on the status of refugees in China. Another woman by the name of Gertrude Van Tin, and I apologize, T-I-J-N, if I pronounce her name wrong, she had been a German Jewess living in Holland during the war, and she was very much involved with the Jewish community during the Holocaust. There's a great book by Wasserstein, The Ambiguity of Virtue, all about her life. She shows up in Shanghai to work for the UNRRA and the CNRRA, and they put her to work with the European refugees. She's going to be a great asset to JDC. Next. Here you see Beckelman and Leavitt on the right. Okay, that's next. Now, the Chinese government finally issued in November and December, actually November 27, 45, regulations on the repatriation of Germans, former Austrians, and German Jews. What did they decide? They want all Germans, Austrians, former Austrians, including German Jews, should all be repatriated. When someone said, how can you send the Jews back there? They made the comment, they said, but the Allies defeated the Nazis. The Nazis aren't there anymore. Now, there were various ways of people getting temporary stays, but the handwriting was on the wall. Everyone should be repatriated. We don't want the refugees to stay. And that's what Siegel understood and made known, that it had a negative effect on the standing of refugees. Next slide, please. Now, Jordan showed up. He came at the end of December, and he wrote his first report after being there only 5 days. He made it very clear that the government would not implement the proclamation. In other words, he said, the government made it clear, we don't want the refugees. This influenced public opinion amongst the Chinese. They became more aggressive towards refugees. Municipalities discriminated more against refugees. All these things were happening. But he said the government is not going to force them out, but they want them out. That should be very clear. Jordan had tremendous praise for the refugees. He thought they had strength and fortitude. Now, what he was amazed at was what the UNRRA was doing. They were providing food. And he made the comment, they gave the refugees food they wouldn't dream about. And it also gave them a sense of the world has not forsaken them. For example, everyone got milk. Everyone got milk. Milk, the kids, the sick, the elderly, everyone had milk. They provided enough flour for JDC to bake bread daily, free of cost, and provide to everyone on welfare. JDC estimated that if they didn't get this aid if they didn't get the flour, it would cost them $45,000 a month. Basically, the whole cash assistance program of JDC was made possible by food being given by UNRRA. One of the most popular things were 10-in-1 rations they bought from the US Army, which had all valuable things, including cigarettes and cookies and biscuits and all of that. A lot of it went to the black market. People learned to live with it. They were also supposed to provide medicine, which they really did, but they did inoculate people against cholera, et cetera. Next. Now, what Jordan did was he dismissed all these committees and he decided to run the operation itself. And he asked JDC, which they did, they increased the monthly allotment to $130,000. He was then joined by a social worker named Andy Grodsky, but she was a social worker. Her husband later on became Jordan's top assistant. She ran the community center, which had youth programs, sports clubs. In cooperation with ORT, they set up training, job training. They had like a sort of college seminars in Asian studies, in US seminar. They ran a library with 2,000 or 3,000 books. They provided scholarships for the schools, et cetera. There was a Jewish school called the Kadori School. Freisinger had a private, smaller school, and the Ashkenazi Jewish community had its school as well. Jordan also operated a hospital with 137 beds, and then 3 Quonset huts, which they used for TB patients. And they set up an old age complex, which Jordan thought was the most beautiful. Okay, let's move on. Here you see an outdoor class with Mrs. Grodsky over here. Next slide. This is a table tennis. Those are refugees. Sports became very, very important in their life. Move on. Here you see job retraining in the upper left, arts and crafts down below. And this is the old age home. It looks like where my parents were for assisted living, although this is Shanghai, China, 1946. Move on. Okay, now in the housing, people were housed in what they called Heime or camps, and also in lane housing. Lane housing were private, it's private housing. And the policy was to move people from these homes or camps into private housing. Now, camps were one of two types. They're either dormitory types, on one floor are all women, another floor are all men, that type of thing. And in other places, families had individual units or they shared them with another family, etc. But the policy was to try to move people into private housing in the lanes nearby. So in 46, there were 7 camps with 3,000 people. There were 31 lane houses with 500 persons. In July of 47, the camp population is down to 1,200, and you have now 161 lane homes with 1,600. And there were a lot of problems. We're going to have to skip over this. But one of the major issues was in some of the lane housing and in some of the camps, some of the Chinese claimed this was our housing before the war. We were forced out by the Japanese. They gave it to Jewish refugees. We want to come back. We want our housing back. Okay, so keep that in mind. Van Tin, T-I-J-N, the Dutch woman, German Dutch, who was working with CNRRA, she helped rehabilitate 2 of the camps, paid for by CNRRA and also by JDC. Now, the CNRRA gave 25 Quonset huts to sort of these prefabs, which helped with housing. It reduced density. It was also used in the hospital. Okay, let's move on. This is a home on the left. These are some of the Quonset huts on the right. Let's move, please. This is a lane housing. This is private housing. These were all houses off the lane, almost like a gated community. The problem is there would be some people with certain rights that controlled like one apartment unit. That person could throw anyone out or break the lease. If you had a room there, if the head person switched and someone else became head person, he could get rid of all the other tenants. It was a problematic situation. Okay, let's move on. Okay, now, the Chinese started protesting at some of these camps, claiming this is our housing. They set up tents, they had anti-Semitic banners and things like that. So there's a lot of pressure and then there was pressure by others who owned the camps. The city municipality owned the camps. There was a London Missionary Society that gave the Choa Phung camp. There were like 4 or 5 or 6 buildings. They owned this. It was abandoned. And they said to the JDC, you can use this for Jewish refugees. But at a certain point in time after the war, these people wanted their property back. That was a major issue. And slowly but surely, the camps were abandoned and closed down. Let's move on. Here, we'll skip over this slide. There's a Chinese lawyer that worked for JDC. Let's just move. Now, the main thing that Jordan did was he set up an immigration department. He realized people had to get out, and he wanted them to get out. Now, on his arrival, I'll skip over the quote. Jordan made the comment that he and Beckelman were of the opinion that there's so few Jews, we're talking about 10,000 or so, why they should stay in China. They can be integrated into Shanghai or go to other places in China. That's what they thought the solution would be. After being there for 6 months, he came to the conclusion everyone has to leave. There's no way they're going to stay. The Chinese don't want them. The government doesn't want them. And most of them as well probably want to leave. So Jordan set up this JDC Immigration Department to handle repatriation and settlement. They worked with the consulates, with relatives when you needed documents, and with the refugees themselves. The UNRRA handled repatriation. The IGCR, the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, handled resettlement of stateless German, Austrian Jews going to any place but not the USA. Now, let's, next slide, please. Basically, what happened was these 2 agencies, the UNRRA and the Intergovernmental Committee of Refugees, they paid for a lot of the passages. They paid the tickets. However, there were some cases where they didn't pay for the tickets and the refugees had to pay. There were also provisions in both agencies. If people have resources, they should pay. Now, if there was a situation where the person couldn't pay anything, then JDC covered the passage. But there were serious problems. There's a major issue. How do you determine need? This immigration department was supposed to decide, can a refugee person, can he help pay? Can his relatives pay? And things like that. It was a total disaster in terms of later on trying to collect money. People would say, okay, I'll take a loan from JDC. My relatives can't pay, I'll pay it back. Many, many people never paid back the loans, or else relatives were approached. They didn't want to give. They said, well, JDC is covering it, or the UN is covering it. This was a major issue later on, but we'll leave it for now. Now, the consul began issuing visas in March. They opened up an American consul with preferences given to the yeshiva people to be the first. There was a lot of pressure in Washington and in other places on the State Department to get these people out of China before everyone else. Now, one of the issues that came up, Vienna, JDC in Vienna, which was dealing with a lot of displaced persons in Austria, et cetera, they sent a telegram to Jordan saying, don't repatriate. Don't allow Austrians to go back to Vienna. It's a mess here. We don't need more immigrants. Now, what's interesting is Leavitt of JDC in New York said, that's not our policy. He criticized Vienna JDC and he said, we don't have a policy on repatriation. If the situation is horrible in Shanghai and Jews in Shanghai want to go back to Vienna, let them go. We're not going to encourage them, but we're not going to prevent them from going. Next slide. Jordan offered his services. He said, look, he went to the American consulate and he said, we have an immigration department. Let them coordinate the American consulate with the refugees. So when you want to see refugees, come to us, we'll bring them in. They need documents, we'll provide you with their documents. So you don't get people just coming to the consulate, some even crackpots and nuts and things like that. We'll screen everyone first, we'll bring them to you. So they coordinated all the work with not just the American consulate, but all the different consulates. By October of '46, visas are flowing fast and furious. And then they started using what they call corporate affidavits, where various organizations, including Highest, JDC, Christian groups, could make sure, guarantee that a refugee would not become a public charge without knowing the refugee. Usually affidavits were personal, given by relatives. Next slide, please. Okay, here you see people leaving on ships. On the left, they're going to the United States. On the right, they're going back to Germany. Next slide. We'll do this very quickly. The Australians, they sent over a representative of the Minister of Immigration named Masel. Australia proved to be a tremendous disappointment. Everyone thought Australia would take thousands of Jews. Australia didn't want Jews. Now, what it turned out to be, and I'm skimming over this very quickly, most of the leadership of the Australian Jewish community didn't want Jewish refugees either. Once they realized that these people weren't welcome in the country. Brand at one time from the Sydney Jewish organization, major Jewish organization in Sydney, wrote Jordan and said, if any of these refugees are on their way here, tell them not to say that, tell them when they come, we're Europeans, we're not Jewish. Don't do any press interviews, because everyone is concerned these refugees are taking the place of white Europeans, the English, etc. So they send over someone named Masel who's supposed to interview people. Basically he interviews a lot of white Russians, non-Jews as well. And Masel makes it clear he doesn't like German Jews. He'll take some Polish Jews and Russian Jews, but no, he doesn't like Germans. And in the end, it turned out the Australian government wanted very few Jews, as well as the Australian Jewish community. And I have here the name Susan Rutland, one of my colleagues. Read anything she's written about Australian Jewry and the Jewish refugees from Europe and Shanghai. Next slide. Now, IRO comes in 1947, and they basically take over for the UNRRA, the IGCR, the Chinese group as well, and they're very cooperative with JDC. The major problem with immigration into the United States was German Jews had an advantage because the German quota was large. Those from Austria, Poland, Russia, Czechoslovakia, the quota was very small. That was the major issue. So all these people, the Germans were getting out, but these Jews from other countries, about 3,500, they were stuck all the time. The embassy would get 10 Polish visas every other month, something like that. And there were 1,500, 1,600 Polish Jews. That would take years to get rid of them. Okay, next slide. Now, Jordan, by the end of September of 47, is already to leave. He wants to leave by about June 1st. He explains that by that time, in June of 48, there'll only be about 5,000 people left. And they cut funding now to about 100,000, et cetera. So he says there's going to be a new situation. Someone should replace me. They can do an effective job. Let's go on. So by November 47, about half have left. They'll have 6,500 by the end of the year. They had resettled about 4,800. Almost 4,000 went to the United States. 898 went to Australia. 1,500 went to Austria and to Germany. That's repatriation. Camp population is down. Glassgold is coming to be the new director in February. And again, this is the German quota. The 2,300 Germans were eligible. Now, out of those, there were about 600 women, 600 people that were married or had people in their family from other countries, born in other places outside of Germany, which meant the family probably wouldn't come into the United States because they didn't want to leave some people behind. Okay, let's go on. We have to finish up very shortly. Glassgold comes in March 21st in 48. Here you see the figures are pretty much the same as they were before. I would just mention the Baghdadi community is gone. Most of them were interned. Their property was seized by the Japanese. Most of them left right after the war. There are about 3,000 Russians left. Many of them are leaving. Some are going back to the Soviet Union. Others with money are sending their money to the United States. And Jordan's idea to Glassgold is the Russians will still be here together with about 5,000 or 6,000 refugees. We have to organize the Russians to take over, to deal with the welfare of these other refugees, but all have to leave. Next slide. We're about to finish up. Well, let me just lead to the conclusions. My apologies for having rushed at the end, but this is the conclusion. Restaino, who wrote probably one of the best books about the refugees in Shanghai, made it very clear and argued that most of the refugees after the war wanted to leave. Unlike the Baghdadis and the Russians, for them, the refugees, Shanghai was a waiting hall. There's another scholar, less well known, named Gelderman, a German, who made the comment that at first, many of the refugees were willing to stay. They were tired. They didn't want to start life all over again. They were old, ill. Europe was deaf. Of course, America was different, et cetera. Now, but in terms of my study and the evidence that I found, there's very little evidence on this. I don't really have evidence to show whether they wanted to leave or to stay. All there were a couple of surveys done where people expressed where they wanted to go. Next slide. Now, Restaino makes the comment that the Civil War and the economic crisis, China had changed. What changed in China? She says the Civil War and the economic crisis, such that all Russians, Baghdadis, and refugees wanted to leave. That's an interesting point. But now, what I found in my research, which surprised me, it's not until 1948, 2 years after the war already, or even longer, that JDC starts talking about the communists are 30 miles out of the city or 40 miles out of the city. In other words, it was never a factor in anything to do with JDC, whether it be JDC in Shanghai or JDC in New York, the communist threat. That didn't matter. More significant, what's clear from day one is the policies of Chiang Kai-shek's government. He did not want the refugees to stay. He wanted them out. And what one has to understand, it has to be placed in the context of extraterritoriality, occupation, colonialism. He wanted a sovereign, independent China. And in the context of that time, it required the refugees have to leave too. They're not anti-Semitic, they're not anti-Jewish, etc. European refugees have to be out. We don't want Europeans. Some said we don't want Americans either. He wanted to reestablish sovereignty. And what Jordan did, whenever there'd be pressure on camps, these demonstrations by the Chinese, he'd go to the city hall and promise them, we're leaving, we're getting them out, we're getting them out. Then the city would intervene, stop the demonstrations, realizing it's only a matter of time. Okay, next slide. Now, some of the other findings that I'd mentioned very, very quickly, and then we'll open it up to questions. Most people that wanted to leave, they wanted to go to America. What's ironic is there was a quota system, the same quota system which kept Jews out in the 1930s, kept them out after the war. But the other thing is there were a lot of policies. There's a great book called The Last Million by David Nasaw, N-A-S-A-W. It deals with the displaced persons in Europe. He doesn't deal with Shanghai. But basically, all the policies in Congress with the DPs were based on one assumption. We don't want Jews into America. They even took the German quota, which Jews benefited from, and they decided 50% of the German quota are going to be for Germans born outside of Germany, the Sudeten Germans, and things like that. One should understand that most Jewish DPs came to Europe after 46, 47 when they came back from Poland, not immediately after the war. That's a story in itself. Second, the Australian government and Jews wanted to restrict Jews. Third, the aid of the UN, RRA, et cetera, and these groups, this was crucial for JDC. Without the UN support, JDC probably would have gone bankrupt. They wouldn't have been able to finance the aid to Shanghai. That's something that one should keep in mind. The final thing is Jordan realizes he's left with a hard core. By the end, who's left? The elderly, the sick, a lot of people with TB, a couple of hundred. No one wants them. And what he thought is he might be able to repatriate some of the sick, the TBs and others. Repatriation appealed to him back to Germany. And then maybe Germany will put a lot of these people into institutions, including elderly, et cetera. And what he realized was he also had a plan to send some elderly to the United States, provided American Jews would be willing to raise a lot of money. And then he said, what we need the Ashkenazi survivors that are still here, the Russians. They have to be organized. And with JDC funding, they can keep the operation going. So what this leads me to, this all ends in the beginning of 48. The state of Israel is going to be created. And let me see the last slide. Now, this is a Jewish refugee with TB, tuberculosis, is held off the ship that brought him from Shanghai to Israel, Haifa. JDC is going to work out with the Israelis setting up Malben, a special system of hospitals and care for the elderly, for the sick. That's going to be the solution for Shanghai. Those that are left that no one wants, Israel is eventually going to take. JDC is going to help to finance it. Thank you.
Fred, that was a fantastic talk. So interesting on a number of levels. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure that many others did too. I'm now going to open the floor to questions. I have several in the chat. I have one or two of my own. If you have an interest in posing questions to Professor Lazin, please put your questions, add your questions now in the Q&A. And as time permits, Professor Lazin will respond. Fred, our first question, did JDC provide cash and other assistance to Shanghai Jewish refugees between 41 and 44? And if not, how did they survive?
Oh, okay, that's a great question, but I thought I mentioned in the beginning, when Laura Margolis and Manny came over, they set up committees. They set up committees that were going to run this operation. The other thing is that they took out loans. First, it was for $180,000, which would have covered things for about 6 months. And they went to the Japanese. And the Japanese said to them, oh, you want to raise money? Fine. Raise it from neutrals. In other words, if they went to the Russian Jews and others, as long as they didn't want them to take money from the British, because the British were all going to be interned. And they were considered enemies, enemy aliens. So they raised this money, and there was money there during the war through 1944. The loans covered things. And then later on, through Switzerland, with the approval of the United States government, they started sending money back into the country. One of the things which is interesting and ironic is that they used the black market with money, especially after 45. And one of the things they were worried about, if the government would ever crack down, they'd have more problems. Money went very, very far on the black market, which is.
Were they allowed to work during the war period, the 41 to 45 period?
Well, during 41 and 45, I didn't mention most Jews that arrived in the country after 1937 were put into a confined area. Some people refer to it as a ghetto. There was wire around it, and you couldn't get in or you couldn't get out. You needed a permit, etc. Now, many Jews, especially the Baghdadis, but some of the Russians and some of the immigrants who had decent apartments in other parts of the city and worked in other parts of the city, were forced into this restricted area. So they lost their apartments, they lost their businesses, etc. Now, most of the Russian Jews were not interned. They continued to work, they continued to exist during the war in Shanghai. Now on the Baghdadis, those with British citizenship were interned, all their property was confiscated. Those with Iraqi citizenship were left alone. But one should understand about, I'm not here to sing praises to the Japanese. A lot of people know how some American soldiers who were prisoners of war were treated. But there were people tortured by the Japanese in the gatehouse, prison, etc. But these internment camps for the Jews were, they were harsh and everything. But for example, provisions were made for people keeping kosher. They had Shabbat services. They celebrated the holidays. It depended who the commander was of the camp.
Okay. We have lots of questions. We have
Okay.
more questions than we have time, Fred. So let me move on. One of our visitors from Fudan University is interested to know more about the religious aspect of their lives, which I think you've just shared with us some additional facts. Perhaps you could comment a little bit more on that.
Okay, to the student at Fudan who's working on her doctorate, the Miri Yeshiva group through Sugihara in Kovno, or Kaunas, Lithuania, made it all the way across. They went across the Soviet Union. They took a ship then down. They were in Kobe, Japan. Then they come to China. They were absorbed by the local Jewish community, especially the Baghdadis that were, it's interesting, the Baghdadis that were religious gave them one of the largest synagogues. And the large synagogue, that became the yeshiva for a while. Many of them slept there. Basically, they had their own aid coming in from the United States. This caused some problems with JDC. The members of this community got much more aid than the average Jewish refugees. But they basically managed to keep the yeshiva going from 1941 until they left in 46 and 47. And it was probably the only yeshiva that got out. Most of the teachers and most of the students and their families all got out. So they were a religious community. Now, what's interesting is amongst the Baghdadi Jews, there were many religious Jews, and they lived according to Orthodox law. They ate kosher all during the war, and they went to services. They observed all the holidays, etc. Although amongst the younger people, there was a little more assimilation, and not everyone was religious.
Okay, perhaps we're going to have to move on, even though I think that there's lots to say, continue to say about that. Oh, here's an easy one, Fred. Could you repeat the name of Nassau's book?
Yeah. The book is The Last Million by David Nasaw, Nasaw. It just came out.
It was reviewed in the New Yorker in the last 6 weeks for the questioner.
It was reviewed in the New York Times. That's where I saw it the first time. Excellent book.
Have you studied? Here's the next
He even
question.
makes there's one point he makes. Excuse me. There's one point he makes which I think is worthwhile to make. He talks about his argument that he makes is Truman's support for the state of Israel and wanting 150,000 Jews being able to go to Palestine was partially motivated by the desire, we don't want them to come to America.
We have a question. I'll come back to that one. Here is did the UNRRA policy with Jews in Shanghai, here it is, influence the UN discussion on the state of Israel? So this would be the UN as a...
That's an interesting question. I don't really know. I don't know. But one of the things that one should be aware of, and I was a little surprised, in these aid organizations, there was some form, look at, what's his name, Beckelman. although he wasn't, he was with the IGCR, the Intergovernmental Committee of Refugees. He was, you know, it's as though someone who was very senior, well, not senior, he was a field person for JDC. He went to work for them. The woman from Holland, JDC. They were working in these UN related agencies. So it tended to make these agencies empathetic towards these refugees. Whatever, but whether it affected, I don't think it had any effect later on what happened in the UN debates. Those were political debates.
Okay.
But the one thing that JDC was surprised, look, at one of the sensitive issues, and this some of my Chinese scholars I'm sure are interested in, the UN is taking care of 800,000 Chinese refugees. It's taking care of 10,000 Jewish refugees. The Jewish refugees are getting better conditions. And there's a quote I have someplace in the article, which I hope to publish very, very soon, where Jordan is saying, we made a distinction between our housing needs, the needs of the European refugees, and the needs of the Chinese refugees, housing needs. And we got away with it. He was surprised. He was surprised and pleased because if everyone, you know, as bad as things were for the Jewish refugees, whatever was bad for them, it was much, much better than what was happening with Chinese refugees. And the UN was responsible for everyone. Much of the UN aid that didn't go to the Jewish refugees that the Chinese were responsible for ended up with the Chinese army rather than with refugees. That's according to many Chinese sources.
Okay. We have another question. Was the JDC in Shanghai aware of the hundreds of thousands of Eastern European Jewish refugees in evacuation in Central Asia during the war between 41 and 44? And is there any evidence of JDC outreach from China to Central Asia?
Okay. Look at my research here was on 45 to 47. So you're talking about during the war. So I really can't comment on that. But there was no one. One should understand that once Laura and Manny were arrested in the end of 42, there was no one in JDC, no JDC person inside of China during the war, to the best of my knowledge. So I just don't know.
What can you say about the role of Canada, if any?
Canada, what's interesting is some of the religious people that got out in the beginning, some of the early people that got American visas, a lot of them got transit visas by way of the United States. They went to Canada. So Canada took X number of people. Now, the UN, one of the interesting issues, the UNRRA had what they called group projects rather than individual projects, where a country might say, we want refugees. And generally speaking, the Shanghai refugees were excluded from these projects. I think Canada had one project, but X number of people went to Canada. I just don't have the numbers.
Okay. What is the population of Jews? This is not a little afield from your talk, but what is the population of Jews in China now?
I really don't know. The one thing I would say is in 2019, when I went to the opening of 2018, I went to a Hanukkah party in December, run by Chabad. In Shanghai, there were either 2 or 3 Chabad outposts. So there are probably a couple of hundred. So 300 people showed up at a Hanukkah party. 300 men, women, and children. I'd say 90% or 95% were Jewish. There were Israelis there working with companies. There were Americans, a lot of business people and their families. There were Chinese married to Jews. There's a community there in Shanghai. There's a community in Beijing, Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong is separate status, but I don't know the numbers.
Okay. Have you, in your studies, have you looked at how JDC help in other Chinese cities besides
That's
Shanghai?
one of the things. This is that's my next project, is to look at the years 46, 48. Now, JDC, one of the UN agencies, wanted to send someone to one of the cities in northern China where there were Jews under communist control. So JDC paid for the ticket, and they sent the UN guy up there. And Jordan said, look, the last thing we need is to have an influx of Jews from other parts of China. However, if it means it's the only way they're going to get out now before, when the communists are willing to let them go, we'll manage, et cetera. So there was contact made with all the other Jewish communities around China. And eventually what's going to happen, JDC is going to coordinate the exodus out. Hayes and Heime are also going to play a role too. They're going to right. But one of the things that was fascinating to me when I did the research in the beginning, this whole issue of people paying. It's an amazing. Someone could write a book about this. That in the beginning, I looked at some of the later period first. So there were people from other parts of China that are going to Israel, and they're told, we'll pay your ticket, but you have to cover your baggage. So people had automobiles, pianos, and stuff like that. And then no one paid the bill. So the stuff was left in Hong Kong or some other place on the way because it was going to be sent by ships. They might have been flown out, Alaskan Airlines, et cetera. And then afterwards, there's a big fight over it to get these people to pay. So someone in JDC in Jerusalem is supposed to go around to Haifa and all these other places and collect, and no one wants to open the door to them. You know, that type of thing. So it's some of the stuff, it's interesting, but it's a lot of money.
Yes, yes.
And it's an interesting aspect of when you do research about this, it makes it even more interesting. Some of these the more human side of human nature and things like that.
Another question. What other countries accepted refugees from Shanghai?
Oh, well, they went to a lot of, well, first of all, the United States, they went to South American countries. Now, one of the problems you had already in 47 with the communists coming in, that if you're in Shanghai and you're going to go to Chile, you have to have a visa to Chile, and you have to get a ticket to Chile. There's no Chilean consul in Shanghai, and Shanghai is cut off from the rest of the country. So what happens? Now, in order to go to Chile, you have to go by way of the United States. So you go to the American consulate, and the American consulate says, you want a transit visa to go through, you want to go to San Francisco, and then from San Francisco to Chile. Okay, but we can't give you a transit visa unless you show us the visa to Chile. But the immigrant, the refugee can't get a visa to Chile because there's no Chilean consulate in Shanghai. So what did JDC? He found the solution, Charles Jordan. He worked out a deal where the Chilean consulate, the Chilean consulate in, the Chilean consulate in San Francisco would agree in principle to give X a visa to go to Chile from San Francisco if he showed up. And on the basis of that, the American consul in Shanghai would give X a transit visa to go to San Francisco. So they solved the problem. Jordan knew how to solve problems. So they went all over South America, various places. And there was even a project, which I didn't deal with in this talk, in Santo Domingo in Haiti, in the
Dominican Republic.
Dominican Republic, thank you, which JDC was very much involved in.
We have a Chinese attendee who would like to know whether your research covers Jews working in psychiatry, medicine, and asylums in Shanghai in the first half of the century.
No.
Okay. Somebody would like to know, sorry. If you could talk a little bit more about baptized Jews, since that seems to be a category that you, a defined category, if you will.
Okay, well, it turns out, well, this I'll say, I'm just saying as a scholar doing research, but it surprised me a little bit. I mean, all of a sudden, you assume, even you have to be careful with the use of words. We're talking about Jewish refugees, European Jewish refugees. And it turns out 15% were not Jewish. They were Christian. And it's not as though, and so some of them were married to Jews, but some of them went to churches. And then there was a Catholic group of refugees in the city, and there was a Protestant group of refugees in the city. They cooperated with JDC. And these people that were baptized were living in facilities run by JDC, getting aid from JDC, et cetera. They were there. Now, it seems that the people that were, I didn't tell the whole story. At one time, they started complaining. There were a lot of complaints made to various people. Eleanor Roosevelt got up to the letter about we're being discriminated against, et cetera. And so these Catholic and Protestant groups in Shanghai came to Jordan, and Jordan talked with them. And then they said, we want you to write a letter condemning it. Or, it's coming out. And Jordan said, I don't want to give it publicity. It doesn't deserve it. And what he said was, excuse me. He said, all these people are living together. When there's tension, etc., they blow up. And so words come out and people say things and things like that. He thought it would all blow over. In most cases, it did. People learned to live together. The people that seemed most bothered were the organized ultra-Orthodox groups. Because when there were formal complaints, it was always Agudat Israel and people associated with them that had the problem with the non-Jews. Now, one should keep in mind that for many of the Baghdadi Jews, they were shocked by the German Jews. They're totally assimilated. They don't know anything about being Jewish. They're intermarried. They were much more negative towards them than the Baghdadis were towards the German Jews than they were towards the Russian Jews. Even though the Russian Jews were also assimilated but they were more Jewish, Yiddishkeit, things like that. That the Baghdadis appreciated. But they were bothered by the fact that they're not religious.
We have a few questions, but we're getting close to our time limit. I would like to, I've been waiting to ask you this question. The new, Kaufman's new book of Kings of Shanghai dwells considerably on the Kaduris and the Sassoons. I know several people on the call have probably read the book. It got a lot of press. You did not speak much on this topic. I wonder if you could comment for a couple.
Okay, one of the things about Kaufman's book, which I noticed right away, they often make the comments that Sassoon and Kaduri, at least the major members, were very supportive of the refugees coming in. Now, Sassoon was involved, he had his own organization, et cetera. But one of the things that's interesting about the major refugee committee, that these people constantly, the leadership of that committee always made the comment, we don't get local support. The local Jewish community doesn't support us. We have to turn to England. We have to turn to the United States. We have to turn to the JDC. Now, one of the things I'd say, so with, and also, I don't know if it's in his book or another book, but Sassoon is in a meeting and he signs a check. So a lot of times they use the dollar symbol, like 75,000 or 100,000 or whatever, so you assume it's dollars, but sometimes they're talking about Chinese dollars, which is a lot less money. So, no, I'm just, you know, he did wonderful things and he helped immigrants clearly. But the question is, the community itself didn't back it the way the leadership wanted them to back it. Now, on Kadoorie, there's something else which surprised me because he talks a lot about the Kadoories, especially Horace Kadoorie, always interested in education. So what happened in 46, there was a problem keeping the Kadoorie school open. And Kadoorie, we're talking about $1,000 a month or $6,000 or something like that. Kadoorie, he didn't want to put up the money. In the end, he did. But what he also said was, he said, take our name off the school, which is interesting. You know, they're so big in education. No, I got to be careful because they support education every place, including for the Chinese. But yet here's an example where at one point he says, take our name off the school. Now, one thing in his favor, which Kaufman doesn't deal in the book, later on, and I didn't deal with it here, after 48, 49, when Glassgold leaves and goes to Hong Kong, who gives him an office to run JDC? Horace Kadoorie. Who arranges for everyone to go to Australia by way of Hong Kong? Horace Kadoorie. He does everything.
The question is whether you have done research about the pre-World War II history of Jews in Shanghai. Have you published anything on that topic?
I haven't published anything, but the one thing I started looking at, but I didn't go back to 33. I started following from 36 or 37.
Okay.
And there are a lot of doctors. Someone asked, it's clear that after from 33 on, some very well-known German Jewish doctors made it to China, not just to Shanghai, to various places.
Okay. We have a comment that Russian Jews were actively involved in helping support refugees. This person says he or she doesn't know if they did it with JDC, but that they were supporting new European immigrants and refugees in the ghetto. Is that consistent with what?
Yeah. When saying the ghetto, during the 43, the Russian Jews were very helpful, were very, very helpful and very supportive of those people in what was called the ghetto, in terms of clothing, in terms of food, in terms of providing employment. One thing I will say in defense of the Baghdadi Jews, most of them were interned, so they weren't helping anyone. But the Russians were not interned, but they were that time they were very helpful to the people in the ghetto.
Okay. Somebody else has commented that during the war, refugees could leave the ghetto or enclosed area if they had a letter saying that they were employed outside of the ghetto.
More or less. There's not a lot of controversy, but I mean, one has to be careful about. For a while, there was one Japanese person that was in charge of like the guard station, getting out and getting passes. There was a little sadistic, that type of thing, and a lot of people went through horrible humiliation, and there were incidents. But we're not talking about people being killed. I've only found one incident where someone disappears. There was some refugee someplace, I've never seen the name, but he evidently had a bicycle altercation with a Japanese military vehicle. and he complained and started arguing and fighting, he disappeared. But short of that, I mean, people were humiliated in the ghetto and all of that. But the only thing that I would be careful about, I mean, it's not like a German ghetto, World War II. It's something different. It doesn't in any way resemble what the Germans did in Europe when they put Jews inside of ghettos. Even though some people that write history, and some people say it was a German idea. The German Gestapo gave the Japanese the idea, but I've never seen that documented.
I'm gonna give one more question, and then I think we're gonna have to close because we're past our appointed time. Well, two more. One was whether you found in the archives something that indicating that JDC had planned to seek coordination with the Chinese communists if need be, if there were still Jews to repatriate.
Wait a minute, I'm sorry. Can you still hear me? I left my screen here. Okay. Can you repeat the question?
Did JDC have a plan to seek coordination with the Chinese communists to attend to the refugees?
Well, first of all, at a certain point in time, the Chinese communists take over and JDC still has a director in the city. So they had to cooperate and they had to coordinate with the Chinese communists.
Okay. Last question.
Now, what happened was Glassgold was there when to the best of my knowledge, although again, this a year or two ahead, Glassgold was there when the city was occupied, and Glassgold eventually, he had to go to court on various types of things. It took him about a year or two to get out. They wouldn't let him leave in the beginning. But he's still there. And then later on, there's a local committee which the Chinese communists recognize, which is being funded by JDC. So JDC would have to coordinate with them.
Fred, several people wanted to know whether you were publishing the content of your lecture today in an as is or in an expanded form. Are you coming out with a book or an article?
Oh, I hope it'll be published as an article, but it hasn't been accepted yet. Yeah, I hope it'll be a chapter in a book, but it hasn't been accepted yet.
I think we are at the end of our time. In closing, I have two comments. First of all, Fred, thank you so much. This was excellent, and I've participated in a number of archives program, and I can tell you that the volume of questions and the volume of attendees testifies to the interest people have, and the questions that were raised by your talk. Yasher Koach, it was terrific that you could present this material.